Hi, everybody. I don't see anyone else signed on but me, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's a little bit after 8, and the purpose of this video session is to go over chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. These are the low incidence disabilities. So we're getting down to the wire here. We've got, I guess, 2 more units to go. This one on low incidence disabilities, and then the last unit that covers a few miscellaneous things. So we'll go ahead and dive in, and I'm going to share the screen with the PowerPoint. And we'll look at chapter 8 first. It's taking a minute for it to load. All right, here we go. This chapter is about students who are deaf or hard of hearing. And so we'll start with a discussion of this chapter. We begin with some discussion of terminology. And this is one of the disabilities that is most unique because some of you probably have friends or acquaintances or family members who may be a part of the deaf community. And when we use the capital D for deaf, that refers to members of the deaf community and the deaf culture. And this is one of the few disabilities that, hi Chelsea, how are you? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Chelsea?
Yes.
Okay, good, good. I just got started, and it's just you and me right now, so I'm recording.
Oh, okay.
I'm recording this, so feel free to chime in whenever you want to if you've got questions, okay?
Okay.
In fact, let's stop for just a second because this is the very first slide of this PowerPoint. Do you have any questions about anything that we've done up till now in the course?
No, not so far.
Okay, so then I'll go ahead and get started talking about this.
Okay.
This is chapter 8, and this is one of the most unique disabilities, deafness and hard of hearing, because this is one of the few disabilities where there's a culture all of its own within the deaf community, where it's almost it's kind of hard to explain. It's almost as though within the deaf community, it's perceived as not being a disability. Now, those of us who are outside of the deaf community perceive deafness to be a disability, but there is a subset of the deaf community that doesn't see deafness as a disability at all. And they want to close themselves off from the hearing community and just exist within the deaf community. Now, that usually happens when all the members of a family, or most of the members of a family, are all deaf. We don't see it so much when only 1 or 2 members of the family are deaf. It happens when that deafness is pervasive throughout a family. Usually if you have hearing parents and you just have a deaf child, you're not going to have that perception of deafness in the same way you would if there are multiple members of the family who are deaf. When we have the capital D, then we have that designating deafness as in the deaf community. The lower D just refers to people who have significant hearing loss but are not identified as members of that deaf community. or that in that culture. The term hard of hearing refers to people who are mildly, all the way up to severely hearing impaired, but who probably do use speech to communicate. Most of the people who are part of that deaf community with the capital D use sign language for their method of communication. People who are hard of hearing or who have some degree of deafness that's not profound or complete deafness usually use some sort of educational or technological support for their hearing impairment. And they may or may not identify with that deaf culture. The term that we use in the educational community is either hearing impairment or auditory impairment. In the state of Texas, we use the term auditory impairment, and we call it we abbreviated AI for an auditory impairment. It's the same thing as a hearing impairment, and it all or partial a loss of hearing. The history of hearing impairments is that individuals with hearing impairments have been denied legal and human rights, as well as education and social interaction historically. This goes all the way back to the 15 and 1600s, as your book talks about, when the Spanish began teaching deaf individuals to communicate. The first free public schools for deaf children began in the 1700s. Back in 1864, during the Civil War era, Abraham Lincoln authorized National Deaf Mutes College to grant degrees, and that institution later became Gallaudet University, which survives till today even in Washington, D.C. It's a university exclusively for deaf individuals. Now, you can attend that school if you're not deaf, but it would certainly be a disadvantage because the vast majority of the student body and most of the administrators and instructors are hearing impaired or deaf. And a few years ago, I think your textbook talks about this. They had a demonstration there on the campus. The students just basically shut the campus down because the president of the university was not part of the deaf community. The president was a hearing individual, and the students protested in favor of wanting a president of the university who was also part of the deaf community and was hearing impaired. And at that point, the sitting president of the university stepped down and said, you know, I honor your desire to have a member of your community as your president. And at that point, the president stepped down and somebody who was hearing impaired took his place. During the late 1800s, there was what we call the oralist movement. There was this movement among the deaf community and with people who worked with those who were hearing impaired to get people who were hearing impaired to speak more. And so there was, you know, kind of almost looking down on people who didn't use oral language as their means of communication. Now into the latter century and even the current one, we have an advocacy for protection of individual rights and whatever means of communication a person wants to use, whether it's oral communication or sign language. Certainly we have access to all kinds of schools, inclusion in schools and communities for people with hearing impairments. The clinical definitions for hearing disabilities is based on the type and degree of hearing losses. We determine that through decibels and frequencies. Talks here about the human hearing, the hertz that we would expect that to be, and how we make that determination is through an audiologist. The next page has a diagram of the ear and where those disorders occur. Hearing impairments can occur at all different places in the ear itself and actually in the brain on its way to the ear. You can have impairments that actually occur before you ever get to the ear. Here's a diagram that talks about hearing loss in decibels and what signifies varying degrees of hearing loss: mild, moderate, severe, and profound. It's a pretty interesting chart that equates things with varying sounds in our culture. We've got several different types of hearing loss: sensory neural, that's when you have nerve damage; conductive hearing loss, um, caused with the transmission of sounds, and then a mixed hearing loss. That's where you have both conductive and sensory neural. This talks about the degree of hearing loss, mild, moderate, severe to profound. How we separate deaf individuals from those who are hard of hearing is that 90 decibel or greater loss. And then here are the different terms that we use to describe the age of onset, when a person begins to have their hearing loss. Some people have no hearing at birth, and that would be considered a congenital loss of hearing. Adventitious is when the hearing loss occurs after birth. Prelingual is when the hearing loss occurs before language is acquired. And postlingual occurs after the development of speech and language. So as you might imagine, the best time to lose your hearing is postlingual and adventitious. Then you've already acquired language. You know what sound sounds like. You know what language sounds like. And so it's much easier to communicate if you've already acquired language, if you've already had some period of hearing in your life. If you're born with a hearing loss, you have no hearing, and you're not able to hear before the acquisition of language, then you're at a much greater disadvantage. So when we look at education law, here are the definitions of deafness and hearing impairment according to education law in the U.S. Deafness is a hearing impairment that is so severe that the child is impaired in processing linguistic information through hearing with or without amplification that adversely affects the child's educational performance. And a hearing impairment is when the hearing, whether permanent or fluctuating, adversely affects a child's educational performance, but it's not included under deafness, so it's obviously not as severe and it's not complete. About 0.11% of all school-age children are in special ed because of deafness or hard of hearing. So that's just over 1 in every 1,000 of individuals ages 6 to 21. So it's a very small percentage, actually, that we come across in our schools. It's not always identifiable. Some causes are excessive noise, loud noises. Some people say, a lot of rock music when you're young will cause a hearing loss, and that's actually true. It will. A lot of headphone usage does actually tend to damage your hearing. The conductive hearing loss can be caused by abnormality in some of the bones in the eardrum. It can be caused by blockages. A lot of ear infections early in life can cause a conductive hearing loss. A perforated eardrum. Otitis media, that's ear infections. Sensory neural hearing loss is caused by a number of syndromes. That's when it has to do with more the brain portion. You see a list of syndromes there. And environmental causes, including rubella, that's the measles, and other viruses that can cause that, where it affects the brain portion. Some cultural characteristics of students who are deaf or hard of hearing. As I said at the beginning, that deaf community is a very distinct culture. They use ASL, American Sign Language, as their primary means of communication, and they identify themselves very separately as part of this deaf community, and they don't feel like they need to be enmeshed in society in general. They don't feel like they need inclusion with others, with typically developing kids in regular schools. They are perfectly fine with being separated. There are no intellectual impacts on students who have deafness or hard of hearing. Sometimes they're a little bit slower to acquire some academic kinds of skills because of their hearing loss. That's what it says on this slide. Achievement scores are lower, but assessment issues may affect these scores. We would expect them to be a little lower and slower in each of the academic areas because of their disability. Speech and language is where a whole lot of the differences come. Spoken language is often very delayed, particularly with kids who have congenital hearing loss. They can attain intelligible and age-appropriate speech, but it usually is slow in coming. They're going to have language delays, and usually sign language is the child's natural language and will best prepare them for later learning English language skills. Socially and emotionally, they usually have some difficulty just because of that lack of ease in communication. So how do we identify them? Well, usually they're identified by medical professionals. Usually that happens early on. We have tests for deafness and hard of hearing that we do right after babies are delivered. And we'll talk about the visual ones in a few minutes when we talk about visual impairments. But we also look at audiometric evaluations as children begin to grow a little bit. Parents are usually the first to notice. If it's not noticed in the hospital, after a child is born, then it's noticed early on by the parents or the babysitters if they spend a lot of time with children. When they start to call the child's name, the child doesn't begin to turn its head when it's spoken to, things like that, then caregivers are the ones who notice. That receptive language doesn't seem to be stepping up the way it should for typically developing kids. They don't discriminate sounds the way typically developing children do. And the thing that makes the hearing impairment one that rises to the level of disability means that it has an adverse effect on the educational performance of the student. So how do you teach a student with hearing loss or deafness? Well, the primary thing that we want to do is focus on effective communication. We also want to build those opportunities for social interaction. Literacy can be an issue with children because it's hard to learn to read if you can't hear yourself with the reading opportunities. So we want to provide authentic experiences. We want to do some read aloud opportunities in the means that are available to the students. So if they're a sign language reader, then we want to make sure that we have those opportunities available for them. We want to teach lots of rich vocabulary and comprehension. We want to analyze their miscues, their mistakes in their reading, and give a lot of feedback early on so they don't continue to make those mistakes. We want to give lots of hands-on opportunities in science, math. We want to give opportunities with other children who have deafness. And we want to make sure that we give a lot of support when it comes to transitioning into post-secondary opportunities. We want to give students who are using oral language every opportunity to do so, but we also want to make sure that that we accommodate students who don't choose to use oral language. So if it's lip reading or speech reading, we want to make those opportunities available. If it's ASL that they use, if it's finger spelling, signed English, cued speech, or if it's using all of those together in total communication, we want to make all of those opportunities available for students who have hearing impairments. For students who are kind of riding that fence between the deaf community and the broader community, we want to make sure that they don't feel uncertain about their place in either community. So we want to make them have a firm footing in any culture that makes them most comfortable. So where should these students receive their education? Well, that varies a whole lot because some students with hearing impairments want to be enmeshed in the general education setting with their typical developing peers, and for some that's very appropriate. Other students may want to have a sign language interpreter with them in a general ed setting. Others may want to be served in a regional day school. All across Texas, we have regional day schools that serve a multi-district area. Stephenville, where are you, Chelsea? Are you in Fort Worth or Waco or Stephenville?
Fort Worth.
You're in Fort Worth. Well, Fort Worth ISD is one of the regional day schools, and it serves several of the surrounding school districts that aren't big enough to have a deaf ed program. And so those kids would come to Fort Worth from some of the surrounding areas. But Crowley is also a day school for the deaf. Birdville is a day school for the deaf. Weatherford is a day school. So those area schools also serve kids with hearing impairments in those smaller communities around Fort Worth. So kids can go to those regional day schools if their local district doesn't have a program for deaf education, or sometimes they opt to go to the state school for the deaf down in Austin. And if they opt to do that, then the local school district has to pay for them to go there in a residential setting. And the kids that go there live in a dormitory type setting, and live there all school year long and get all their education in a setting with other students who have hearing impairments. And they're deeply enmeshed in that deaf culture while they're there. So we've got here some other things that we need to consider after we determine the least restrictive environment, how we want to use materials for students, transition times, using graphic organizers, things like that. Some instructional technology that we would use are listed here. One thing that's right there on the horizon for a lot of kids, on the cutting edge for others, is the cochlear implants. And we've got lots and lots of kids who are getting cochlear implants these days. And it's a surgical procedure that actually puts a device into the brain just behind the ear. And you may have seen kids with a cochlear implant in there, right there at the base of their head, behind the ear. And for some kids, it basically does away with deafness. It's amazing what it can do. But there's some controversy within the deaf community. And it's hard for us who are not deaf to understand it. I certainly don't understand the controversy, but there are some people in the deaf community that don't support the use of cochlear implants. And they say, if you're deaf, you should embrace being deaf, and they look down on the use of cochlear implants. Now, I look at it from a totally different perspective. If my child,
Thank you.
If my child were deaf, I would be the first one to sign up for a cochlear implant in order to make them have more opportunities. But people in that deaf community feel like deafness is not a disability, and so you shouldn't fight it. And I think that's just hard for those of us who are not deaf to comprehend. But it's a philosophical notion that the deaf community possesses. So there is some controversy about cochlear implants out there. Other things here that you can read on your own about considerations for kids with hearing impairments in the classroom, and that's the end of that one. Do you have any questions about this one?
No.
Okay, let's look at visual impairments.
No, ma'am.
Is there anybody else on? Is there somebody else on besides Chelsea?
It's Lily. I'm actually on the phone because I came to Six Flags, but I really want to join in for a little bit.
Okay, good.
I'm
I'm
just gonna mute myself. So, I'm sorry.
I said it's nice to hear you.
Yes, I actually. I'll just mute myself so I don't make a lot of noise out here.
That's fine. That's fine. We're going to look at visual impairments now, and Lily, you can look at this later on. I'll post it on Blackboard later, and you can go over it if you'd like later. Okay.
Yeah, awesome. I still want to try and listen as much as I can, but
okay.
if I get disconnected out here, then I'll just cut off.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Sure. This one is on visual impairments, and this is another one of our low incidence disabilities. And what that means is it's infrequently occurring. So auditory impairment is infrequently occurring. Visual impairments are infrequently occurring. They don't happen very often, but when they do, they require quite a bit of support. And so the history of blindness and low vision, this goes all the way back. People have, had blindness and low vision for eons. Back when Homer wrote back, centuries ago, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer was blind. Louis Braille, he's the one who developed the system for reading and writing that's named after him. He was blind back in the 1800s. Formal education for this population began in the U.S., and the American Printing House for the Blind was established in the 1800s. Then the early 1900s saw an emergence of public school programs for children with visual impairments and blindness. The advocacy for this group of people stressed integration into all facets of life. And I think that it's probably been pretty acceptable for people with visual impairments, and even that for people with auditory impairments, because we're more accepting of disabilities that don't have intellectual issues associated with them. And we know that people can be blind or deaf and not have associated intellectual issues. And we're simply more tolerant of that. You know, we can name lots of talented, famous blind people if we just go down the list. You know, if I ask you to do that right now, you would probably name, you know, Stevie Wonder, or let me think, who else? Ronnie Millsap is another country western artist who is also visually impaired. There are several that you know have caught our attention through the years with their incredible talent, but they also happen to be blind. So we're very tolerant of certain disabilities if we see giftedness in other areas, and if there doesn't seem to be an intellectual component to the disability. Professionals in the 1990s developed this Common Core curriculum and a national agenda for students with blindness and low vision. So we've been looking out for kids with visual impairments more aggressively in the last 25 or 30 years. Here's a definition for legal blindness. We talk about being legally blind. There's your definition: a vision of 20 or 2200 or worse in the best eye. Low vision is described here as vision of 2070 to 2200. And then we've got a description of the terms visual acuity and visual field. Visual acuity is how sharp visual images are perceived, and visual field is the scope of what you can see without actually turning or moving your head. There are some disorders that actually tend to narrow that visual field over time and give a person tunnel vision. So the acuity, the accuracy with what the focus of what you're seeing may stay sharp, but the width of what you see is narrowing all the time. So the measure of what you see becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. Visual impairments including blindness, are defined as vision that even with correction adversely affects the child's educational performance. That term includes both partial sight and blindness. What else do we need to know about definitions of blindness and low vision? Well, legal definitions emphasize visual acuity and residual vision. We need to be concerned with how well a student can use residual vision and the impact on educational performance. Students with low vision may be able to use printed materials. Large print books often are very accessible for students with low vision. Students with blindness may need to learn through means other than printed materials. They may be able to access materials that are Braille, but they may need something else altogether. They may need audio materials, things like that. Individuals with the same visual acuity can function differently in the same classroom. So visual impairments vary greatly from one person to another. Now, we're only looking at about 0.04 of the school population having been identified with visual impairments. 90% of all people with visual impairments have some functional vision. So only a very small percentage of the population who is identified as visually impaired are completely blind. Most have some sort of vision, even very limited. So this talks about the types of defects that you can have as part of blindness or low vision. One is refraction. That's when focusing light as it passes through different components of the eye affect what's going on. And refractive errors are more common and include astigmatism. Many people have astigmatisms. Most kids who have the need for glasses as kids have astigmatism, or they may have myopia. That's where you have a hard time seeing the board in class. You can see better at close range than at distances. Hyperopia is where you see better far away than you do close up, and that's what affects most older people who are farsighted. Nearsighted is myopia, and farsighted is hyperopia. We've got a diagram of the eye here that shows us where some of these issues originate. And then I'm not going to go into all this, just the different types of defects of the eye. Lazy eye, when the eye kind of jiggles back and forth, strabismus. Other kinds of issues with the eye, growth, thinning, or inflammation of the cornea. We've got internal eye problems with the retina. Cortical issues, the cortical visual impairment, and you'll hear people talk about this sometimes, has to do with brain damage. So if a person has maybe a traumatic brain injury of some sort, or maybe problems in the birth canal before birth, there may be cortical brain damage that damages that that connection between the brain and the eye. And so the actual eye itself is fine. The connection between the brain and the eye is where the damage is. And so a visual impairment or complete blindness may result. The child may not be able to see, even though the actual eye function is fine. The problem rests between the brain and the eye. Much like some auditory impairments, the problem is between the brain and the ear, not with the actual ear itself. So what are the intellectual characteristics? Well, the inability to see has little or no effect on general intelligence. It may have an impact on socialization or play, because it's simply an alienating issue when a child cannot see or has limited vision. How about language and concept development? Those are really not affected. Those can develop quite typically with most students. Association of words with concepts and understanding may be a little bit difficult without some hands-on experiences, though. What about academic achievement? When considering achievement, we want our assessment methods to allow for the student's visual impairment, but most students with blindness or low vision can succeed at the same rate as their peers, as long as we allow for some accommodations for their limited vision. Visual perception certainly is going to be affected. This is going to affect their orientation in space, their mobility, and the way they find their way around the school building, around the community, things like that. We may see that they have difficulty with social adjustments and psychological adjustment. We sometimes see social isolation and negative reaction from peers, mostly just because of a lack of understanding of the child. So the way we determine blindness and low vision is through medical professionals. And much like an auditory impairment, it starts out most commonly in the hospital right after delivery. A lot of tests can be done right after the birth of a child to see if the eyes are functioning properly. Now, some of those other things, the cortical blindness and things like that, sometimes take a little bit longer to diagnose. But some of the most basic types of visual impairments can be determined right off the bat. Then others, the baby may go home from the hospital and the parent seems to notice, the other caregivers seem to notice that things are going on with the child's lack of visual fixation. When the parent places objects in front of them or speaks to them, they don't fixate. There's not that normal eye movement. They don't track when the parent moves things in front of their eyes. They don't seem to catch the baby's attention with visual stimuli. Now, as children get a little bit older, you'll probably remember having your eyes checked at school. They put the chart up with the big E, And that's called the Snellen chart. And we use that with children once they're school age to make some determinations about visual acuity. We also expect our teachers to help us by describing behaviors like children who squint when they look at the board, when they pull a book up very close to their faces to be able to see it. Children that talk about not being able to see the board, wanting to get out of their chair to go closer to see things, things like that. And then if we get those indications, we would ask for a comprehensive assessment that comes from an ophthalmologist or an optometrist, and then we get a vision teacher involved in that. We do a learning media assessment with a vision teacher. We would want to look at cognition, see how the child is thinking and how it's affecting their academics. We bring a person in who is an orientation and mobility expert. They work with the child to make sure that they are able to make their way around the school building, around the community, things like that. So in case they need a cane or other kinds of methods for moving around, that person is the one who teaches them about making their way around the school. So how do we teach kids with blindness or low vision? Well, we would certainly want to start with the regular curriculum, and then we may need to expand it for their specific vision loss. But we expect kids with visual impairments to be able to work the regular curriculum with some enhancements. We'd want to have specialized curriculum for reading. We would want to teach them self-advocacy skills, self-determination skills. We may want some specialized technology for them. This specialized expanded core curriculum would include the things you see here: compensatory skills for their particular visual impairment. It may be Braille, it may be other kinds of literacy skills, enhanced listening skills, those orientation and mobility skills for getting around the community, interacting with other students, independent living skills, recreation and leisure, and then, of course, transitioning into adulthood. What we've got here are some other kinds of methods for teaching students with visual impairments. We may need to offer some counseling. If the child may have a prosthetic eye, we'd want to teach them care for that. Want to teach them, responding to traffic signals in the community. We'd want to teach them other coping skills, like, giving them a copy of teacher's notes, having read aloud materials, things like that, maybe audio tapes or CDs of materials, other kinds of manipulatives. We would want to provide any kind of specialized equipment that they might need to access what's going on in the classroom. We'd want to make sure that the classroom was arranged appropriately, that their seat was in the right place for the most advantageous learning situation. We want to make sure that we don't move the furniture around, that everything is in a set position so that it's easy for them to maneuver. We want to provide appropriate lighting, tactile materials, decrease visual clutter, things like that. And then any kind of technology that the student needs. We've got a whole list of those things there. We want to make sure that the general ed teacher has all these kinds of things at their disposal for working with the student. And we want to make sure that they provide all the supports that student needs in their classroom. All right, how about that visual impairments? Any questions there?
No, not really. It surprised me at the percentage of the schools that have it. I live in Crowley.
Oh yeah.
I didn't know that there was schools here, and I've lived in Crowley all my life, so that was interesting to me.
Yeah. Which high school did you go to?
Crowley High School.
Crowley High.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The next one is physical and health disabilities. And this is one of the ones that a lot of people think of when they think of special education. They think of kids, that have, physical disabilities. They're in wheelchairs or something like that. But it's actually a pretty small portion of our population. we're going to talk about not just physical, but other kinds of health disabilities as well in this chapter. We go all the way back in history. The first known description of epilepsy comes in 350 BC, so long history there. Cerebral palsy was first described in the 1800s. AIDS, of course, is one of the most recent health disabilities that we have in our schools today. There are three categories that are part of the federal definitions that are going to fall under these categories in this chapter. One is other health impairment. That's disorders resulting in limited strength, vitality, or alertness with respect to the educational environment. And a lot of things fall into that category. ADD and ADHD actually fall into that because they're designated by a medical doctor. Anything that's health related, that's designated by a medical doctor, is going to fall into this other health impairment category. That's also where we would find Tourette syndrome, diabetes, asthma, any kind of a heart disorder, a lung disorder, anything that's health related is going to fall into this category. Orthopedic impairments, these are diseases such as polio, clubfoot, bone tuberculosis, cerebral palsy, spina bifida, muscular dystrophy, anything that's usually related to mobility kinds of issues, things that affect the large muscles, the large bones, things like that, that keep a child mobily disabled. And then the third category here is traumatic brain injury. This is an acquired injury to the brain caused by an external physical force, resulting in total or partial functional disability that adversely affects educational performance. And it includes open or closed head injuries. This is probably one of the saddest categories because these are children who start out non-disabled and become disabled because of some tragic accident or incident. I've worked with kids from this category who had any number of kinds of incidents occur. Kids who had who were in tragic car accidents. I had a student who had a gunshot wound to the jaw. I had a student who was a shaken baby. A babysitter had shaken the student so severely when he was a baby that it shook the brain and caused terrible brain damage. So all kinds of things fall into this category, resulting from trauma to the brain. But again, all of these categories are small. They're considered low incidence, and so we don't have a whole lot of kids in these categories. Here's other health impairment, and there's a list of the things that I mentioned a moment ago. Physical and health disabilities, orthopedic impairments, only about 1.1%. Other health impairments, 0.85%. Now, this is actually the third largest category, but it's a health category. What jacks this category up is our ADD and ADHD. And then traumatic brain injury is 0.04. So we've got some of the primary causes of the orthopedic impairments listed here. Cerebral palsy is one, and that's damage to the different parts of the brain that resulted problems in muscle tone, movement caused by prematurity. Oftentimes our premature babies have cerebral palsy. And it's usually caused by a lack of blood flow or oxygen to the brain prior to delivery. Cerebral palsy can have an impact on the brain and on intelligence, but not always. A lot of people have CP who don't have any damage to the brain. And so, but what we often see with CP is, the muscle movements that lack control, and there's also difficulty with speech. And so some of those markers cause people to think that there must be an intellectual disability as well. And that's very untrue. Usually there's not. Sometimes there is, but usually there's not. But some of those markers make people think, oh, there must be a lot of other things going on there. Spina bifida is where that spinal column doesn't grow together before the baby is born. And this can occur in lots of different degrees. And so sometimes it's almost completely grown together and can be fixed with surgery after birth. Sometimes it's very far from being grown together, and the person has paralysis from the waist down, and then lots of things in between. Muscular dystrophy is an inherited condition or a gene mutation causing muscle weakness, and this grows increasingly worse over time. Here are the different types of cerebral palsy and their effects, and I'll let you read those on your own.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a list of some of the other health impairments that I've talked about a moment ago. It goes into some detail about different types of epilepsy. And then types of traumatic brain injuries. Now, characteristics of each of these. The health impairments vary completely upon the different type of conditions. So the characteristics of a child with asthma are going to vary greatly from a child with Tourette syndrome, which are going to vary greatly from a child with epilepsy. All of those are going to be very particular to the type of health impairment that the student has. Orthopedic impairments, the motor coordination, balance, and coordination are all going to be common factors amongst them. Traumatic brain injury, this is another one that varies a whole lot from person to person. There's usually problems with coordination, walking, vision, speaking. Sometimes there are cognitive difficulties and emotional difficulties. And the worst part about traumatic brain injury is it kind of ebbs and flows. Sometimes things seem to be getting a lot better, and then they change. The way the brain functions, sometimes it has some bouts of recovery, and then it stops. And sometimes it recovers completely, and sometimes it doesn't. It's just really very unpredictable. So how do we identify students for each of these categories? Well, all three of these categories require a medical doctor to make the identification. Some of these things can be determined prior to birth with amniocentesis. Some can be determined through genetic kinds of testing, ultrasounds, PET scans, CAT scans, other kinds of things like that. So how do we teach students with these disabilities? Well, again, it's going to vary widely depending upon the type of disability. So the best thing that you need to do is know your student and know what the disability is, and then know about that disability. The general curriculum should be accessible for most people with any of these disabilities, and that's where we always want to start. And then we want to make things accessible through universal design. We want to take care to look at life skills, social skills, self-determination, and that transition to post-secondary life for all students. We want to look at technology and how we can use that to make things more accessible to students. We want to adjust the curriculum to meet the needs of students, and always consider the healthcare situations of students. Many of these students are going to have a health plan that is part of their school day. It may include administering medications. For students who have orthopedic impairments, it's going to probably include some instructions about lifting and positioning. Sometimes it's eating and feeding. For some students, we have toileting instructions. Some students require catheterization. Others need oxygen during the day or have ventilators, things like this. So we've got to be aware of all of those kinds of issues that go above and beyond just typical education of students in an academic kind of way. Sometimes we have to consider behavioral or social skills support. Sometimes our support goes on into the home, supporting parents and siblings as well. So what do we have to do to the educational environment? Well, for some students, we have to make a lot of accommodations and changes. Students who are in wheelchairs or other kinds of assistive types of devices, we may have to make a lot of changes to the environment and make it more accessible. We may need to train our staff, both our special education staff and our general education staff. Sometimes we need to make a lot of instructional opportunities available to our other students so they understand what's going on. We need to make sure that we've got an array of opportunities along that continuum of services available so that we can serve that student wherever they need to be served. Lots of different kinds of technology have to be available. Specialized keyboards, wheelchairs, wedges, prosthetics, PE kinds of situations that are appropriate for students who have physical limitations, all kinds of things like that. Now, what does the general ed teacher need to know? Well, they need to know how to adapt their materials. They need to know about seating arrangements, technology, making the physical environment safe, not only for that student, but for other students as well. We want to make sure that the student who has the disability is included in all activities and extracurricular activities as well, that they're made to feel a part of the classroom environment, and that opportunities for friendships are fostered with other children. Well, that's the end of that one. Chelsea, you're a trooper. and I won't forget that you're the one tuned in today. I will not forget that. Okay, chapter 11 is one of my favorites. That's autism. Let's look at that one. Let's look at that one. In the regular semester, I show a great video about this, but I can't figure out how to show a video during the summer with everything online. So you have to miss out on that. Now, the thing about autism, people think it's on the rise, and there's a lot of discussion about that. Is it on the rise or is it not on the rise? And I'm not really sure. We're certainly identifying it more than we used to. And is that because we're better at identifying it, or is it because it's radically increasing? Is it because there's something in the water that's causing autism? Is it because I certainly don't believe it's because of vaccines or things like that, that some people would purport that is causing autism. I think that primarily we're better at identifying autism than we used to be. And I think that we have a broader scope of what we say autism is than we used to. I think those are two of the reasons. We first identified autism by that name just about, 50, 60 years ago. It's been around for years. We've called it other things. We called it childhood schizophrenia for a while. It wasn't brought into the American Psychological Association as a psychiatric disorder until 1980. So that's very young. It wasn't first considered a category in special education until 1990. And so that's 27 years that we've had it as a disability in our schools. That's really a very short period of time. So we're still kind of trying to figure it out. And it's changed the way it looks in our schools in that 27 years. It's a developmental disability significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction. So those are the hallmarks of autism. When we're looking at autism, we're looking at primarily verbal and nonverbal communication and the way the child interacts socially. We have to have evidence of it before age 3, and there has to be an adverse effect on the child's educational performance. The individual often engages in repetitive activities and stereotypic movement. They're resistant to environmental changes or changes in daily routines, and they experience unusual responses to sensory experiences. So the last half of this definition kind of typifies what we think of when we think about the child who rocks back and forth, or the child who shakes their hands or flaps, some of those kinds of things, those stereotypical movements. We also think about kids who I had a boy a few years ago in my school who had autism, who was fascinated with the little Thomas the Train engine, and he just played with that nonstop. It was the only toy he wanted to play with. I also had a young man who was a little bit older that I worked with, who was fascinated and fixated on the movie Titanic, and he watched Titanic every single day after school. Now that's a 3-hour movie, you know.
Yeah.
3 hours of Titanic every single day. Now, I would not want to be his mother, having to have that in the background every single day. But he watched it religiously. He knew every single word. I've also heard of seen kids who had a fixation or a fascination with Disney movies. And I've even seen a documentary of one little boy who the only way he communicates is with lines from Disney movies. And he'll take on the persona of the genie out of Aladdin and talk in that voice to communicate all of his thoughts. So there's this issue with communication with others, interacting with others, verbal and nonverbal communication, and then there's also this fixation with certain things within the community and this resistance to change. So things have actually changed since this slide was made. We don't actually have Asperger's syndrome anymore as part of our diagnosis. We have an overriding umbrella of autism. And a lot of people out there have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which is that higher functioning level of autism. But when the diagnostic manual was revised a couple of years ago, they removed Asperger's syndrome and said it's just high functioning autism, when we're not going to call it Asperger's syndrome anymore. So all these people who are out there floating around with Asperger's syndrome diagnoses actually don't have that anymore. It's still out there. We know it. We know the syndrome. We know what it looks like, but we just don't call it that anymore. So we have a few other designations. Rett syndrome is one that applies primarily to girls. It's genetic in nature. Some of these other pervasive developmental disorder is usually a higher functioning. Childhood disintegrative is lower functioning, but they're all part of that umbrella of autism. Now we're looking at, and this number changes from day to day. 1 in 150. When this slide was prepared, I read something the other day that said it was about 1 in 50 of boys, and a little bit higher than that for girls. I'm not sure that I go for that. I think it's probably this may be a little more accurate, maybe a little bit lower than this, but I don't think it's 1 in 50. Autism 60 times more prevalent than childhood disintegrative disorder. It is the most rapidly growing disorder, and is that because what I talked about a moment ago, because there's a greater awareness, because we have improved identification. We do have awareness now that it exists across all IQ levels. When it first came out, the disorder itself, we only identified it with the most significantly impaired individuals, and so you only had autism if you had an IQ in the range of an intellectual disability. And we've realized now that you can be very gifted in the realm of IQ and still have autism. We certainly have a higher ratio of males to females who have autism. Males to females, it's 4 to 1, 9 to 1 for Asperger's syndrome, and Rett syndrome, as I said before, is almost exclusively females. So what causes it? Well, first of all, we don't know. It's thought to be a neurological or brain-based disorder. People say it's mercury in vaccines. That's been pretty much debunked. It may be genetic. It does tend to run in some families. There is some evidence for that. There's some talk that it may be triggered environmentally. When I was working in a school district, I had a group of parents that were pretty sure that it had some connection in their children to gluten and some of those kind of things. They took their kids off of certain dietary things, and they thought that their kids got better when they were put on much more strict diets. All of these things that they said gave them, gut trouble. I don't know if that, I don't think it has any science behind it. Parents seem to think it was improved, but we didn't see much in the way of improvement in the school setting. So I don't know if maybe some of that is just anecdotal evidence, or what you could really say about that. There's no science behind it, but if somebody says that the child seems better, you have to give that some credibility.
Is that a common thing for, like, if you change their diet, that it can improve? Because I know that was one of the questions on the reflection questions, and I just think of autism kind of like the nervous system.
Well, I think you're right. I think it is the nervous system. I think it's much more neurological than it is anything else. I think that's very much a fad right now, to try to point to it being, somehow dietary. I think that may be very desperate families grasping at straws. And if I were in that situation, I know I would grasp at straws too. I would look for anything to give me some measure of hope. But I don't think there's any science behind that at all. I see a lot of, there are a lot of people these days who look for dietary answers for lots and lots of issues. That seems to be a trend in our society right now. And, if you change your diet, it'll get rid of your headaches. If you change your diet, it'll get rid of, just about everything. And I know diet has a lot to do with a lot of things, but I don't think it's a cure-all for everything. So I think we have to be careful about trying to link it to disability that was there at birth, before diet even came into the equation. So that's a good question, and it is one that we want you to think about when you're looking at this chapter. So some of the characteristics are here. You'll find somebody with autism doesn't want to make eye contact. They have difficulty interacting with others. Their verbal and nonverbal communication is, they have very limited vocabulary. Echolalia is when they repeat what they hear. Rigid and restrictive behavioral repertoire. Sometimes they only want to talk about a couple of topics. Those stereotypical behaviors, the repetitive behaviors. Reduced sensitivity to pain. That's another one that's interesting. Let's see, example of a visual processing task. People with autism perform better than average on some visual tests than like picking out the embedded figure. So their visual skills are usually enhanced, whereas some of their other skills are greatly reduced. So how do we identify them? Well, a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a person in the medical field has to make that call. There are a few tests listed here that we would use. How do we teach a child with autism? Well, the range is huge. Some kids with autism are extremely disabled. Some kids with autism are functioning at the very high level. If you ever watch The Big Bang Theory, supposedly the character Sheldon, is on the autism spectrum. Well, he's not hurting too bad as far as educational situations are concerned. He's certainly able to function. So that would be the high end, where he doesn't need a lot of modifications. And then you have people who are functioning at the extremely low end, where they're not even able to talk. They're not able to sit in a classroom without, just having a complete meltdown. My daughter teaches a class of students with autism. So she's got, 7 or 8 children with autism in her class, and there's a whole lot of behavior management going on because much of what's happening in the class is repetitive movements, and there's, a lot of tantruming and other things like that, because the children are very low functioning. So anything, between those two extremes is where you might find yourself. So we want to work on reducing those self-stimulating behaviors, increasing social skills with others. We want to work on academic skills, of course. We want to work on those functional skills, and we want to work on communication with others. So how do we do that? Well, we want to put all these kinds of things in place. A lot of structure, a lot of systematic kinds of instruction, very direct instruction. Sometimes we want to even use hand over hand kind of instruction, where we actually show the student what we want them to do by using their hands, with our hands over them, to give a demonstration of the skill that we want to see. A whole lot of repetition is necessary, usually with students with autism. We've got to practice and practice and practice, and then teach them how to generalize to another kind of situation. Lots of structure, lots of routine. We want to give them a few narrow choices, and then we can broaden those when they learn some of those procedures. A lot of organization in the classroom. Sometimes they have a lot of difficulty with transitions, so we want to help prepare them for transitions. A lot of visual cues, a lot of visual scheduling, and then plan for peer and group work. Most kids with autism work very well with a visual schedule. We want to use computers to help with that. We may have to use alternative communication tools. Some kids are non-talkers. Some need some of that for just basic communication. Some use picture communication systems. That's what PECS is. Some need voice output to kinds of communications to help with that. Many kids with autism spend a lot of time in a special ed classroom. Others, spend a little bit more in the general ed setting. And so we want to make sure that the time that they do spend in general education is planned for very carefully, that the environment is set up to make them successful, that the students who are there are part of that support team to help them be well included and supported. We want to give parents the support that they need and the tools that they need to help their child be successful. Okay, that's our autism chapter. Ready for the last one?
Yes.
I bet you're getting tired of this. Okay, severe disabilities. Oh, this isn't the textbook chapter. This is mine. This is the one that I made. Okay. Historically, this population, these are the individuals who have the most significant needs. And historically, these are the people who were the most segregated, the most maltreated, and usually just institutionalized. This population was certainly on the rise back in the 60s after we had a lot of rubella or German measles. We had a big spread of that. And a lot of kids came out with dual sensory losses, both blindness and deafness. And so when you have that issue, you have a lot of impairment. A little bit later in the 60s, though, we had what we call deinstitutionalization across the country. So a lot of people who had been placed in institutions because of the severity of their disabilities were suddenly sent home, back to the community. And many people didn't know what to do with those individuals who were so significantly disabled. Advocacy organizations started to pop up saying, we've got to get these folks, back into schools. because severe disabilities is not one of those 13 special categories, we came up with 2 categories to help with these folks. One is multiple disabilities, and the other one is deaf blindness. So deaf blindness is where somebody has both deafness and blindness to such a degree that they've got to have help with both. Now, to me, those are the people like Helen Keller, who have both of those disabilities, and they radically impact the individual. Just imagine if you were deaf, you'd at least still have your sight to help you. If you were blind, you'd at least still have your ears. But what if you had neither your sight nor your hearing? Just imagine how disabling that would be. It would be just horrific, I think. How much we depend on our eyes and our ears. To have one missing would be extremely detrimental. To be without both, I can't imagine the frustration that would result from that. But there are people in our world who have that condition, and it's incredibly disabling. We have this other category called multiple disabilities, and that's when a person has at least 2 of the other conditions that we've talked about, at least 2 of the severe conditions that disable them enough that they need lots and lots of support. So here is the official definition of that, of both of those. And then, how are students with severe disabilities classified? Well, we want to look at students who need support for some activities. They need support during certain periods of time during life. They need intensive support in one or more environments, or they need intensive assistance in more than one setting on an ongoing basis. And those are the levels of support that the AAMR designates. Now, the category of multiple disabilities is very small. It's 0.2%. That's 1 in 500 students. The deaf-blind category is also well below 1% of the school-age population. So you're not talking about very many kids here. But when we do see them, they have an incredible array of needs. The causes of some of these disorders, they could be genetic, they could be biological, could be something like fetal alcohol syndrome. It could be viruses or other infections that affect a child, such as encephalitis. It could be like rubella again. It could be environmental, trauma at birth, poisoning, accidents, things that are just so disabling that the child is completely dependent on others, more than likely for a lifetime. Sometimes it's a lack of nurturance, health care, or early intervention, and that could contribute to severe disabilities. Some have diminished cognitive functioning that affects their abstract thinking, learning, attention, and memory. With the severe disabilities category, there's almost always a cognitive component. With the deaf blindness, there's not always that cognitive component, but sometimes there is. Many have significant physical health and communication needs. They usually have significant developmental delays. Usually there's a speech delay, if there's speech at all. Personal social skills, motor skills, attention, memory, mobility, there's just a huge array of needs. Sometimes there's difficulty learning self-care, so oftentimes they're dependent on others for toileting needs, for bathing needs, things like that. There's a need for repetition to acquire skills, lots and lots of practice. There's difficulty transferring and generalizing skills to other areas. We usually identify these kinds of disabilities at birth or shortly after birth with neonatal screening or medical evaluations. We may need a speech-language pathologist to help us with the communication disorders. But unless one of these issues comes along through trauma, like a traumatic brain injury through a car accident or some disease that has onset after birth, all of these would be recognized, at birth. Sometimes we're able to assess IQ for school-age children, but oftentimes IQ is not even an issue with these populations because there are so many other factors that would cloud an IQ assessment. We want to see how the student is functioning adaptively. Are they able to do any self-care? Are they able to communicate? Are they able to feed themselves at all? Are they able to assist in their care? We'd want to know about their medical evaluations. We want to know about their communication evaluations, any kind of observations through transdisciplinary evaluations. So when we got several people together, the occupational therapist, the physical therapist, other people working together to conduct an evaluation, we want to know what the results of those kind of things were. We'd want to know how the family functions together when dealing with the child, how they integrate the student into the family environment. Now, for the children who are deaf-blind, we're going to have an audiologist involved. We're going to have an ophthalmologist involved. We're going to have an otolaryngologist involved. All those specialists who deal with the hearing and the sight. Mm-hmm. Ophthalmologists and optometrists are going to be the ones who deal with the vision. And we'd have to have that combination of specialists working with those children. So how do we teach kids who have this severity of disabilities? Well, again, we want to make sure that the general education curriculum is available to all kids. And we want to make adaptations where we need to. But for this group of students, functional skills are the most important thing. So we want to make sure that their most basic needs are being met. So self-care, basic cognition, communication, how do they communicate their needs? Are they able to move themselves from one location to another if they choose to? How do they interact socially with others? And what kind of transitions are we preparing for them to adult living? We want to remind those who work with them that skill acquisition is going to require a lot more time and a lot more repetition. We want to base all of our instruction on that individual student's needs. We do want to have some general education goals, and we want to look at the general curriculum and see how it applies to this student. We want to teach chronologically age-appropriate skills. We're probably going to have to use very discrete trial training with the students. So break a task down into very small tasks and teach just a portion of the task at a time. We want to provide for as much participation as we can for the student, but that may only be partial participation. So we've got to analyze our activities in class and make opportunities for participation available for that student to the degree appropriate. Use any opportunity to include that student and strategize how we're going to teach them in a naturalistic way. And we're probably going to use a lot of paraprofessionals and family involvement to accomplish our goals with that student. There are a lot of opportunities to make the instructional environment appropriate for that student, opportunities to go onto a job site perhaps, teach the student to use public transportation, get out into the community, figure out how to order a hamburger at McDonald's, some things like that. So we want to give opportunities to access the community. We want to make all of the environments that we provide for that student appropriately adaptable. Lots of opportunities for technology, whether it's a wheelchair or communication kinds of things. We want all of that to be appropriate, and there's lots of different programs that are available for students with this level of need. Some things that we need to convey to our general ed teachers. We want them to all have a welcoming attitude towards students with this level of need to their room, show concern for the success of all students, adjust the classroom to meet the needs of everyone, including the student with a significant disability. Select effective teaching methods and materials, collaborate with the special education staff and the student's family, and assess effective instruction, the effectiveness of instruction for the student. And that's the end of that one. And you did it, Chelsea. You hung in. Good for you. Okay. You have any questions?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, we're done. That was an hour and a half. Golly, you're a trooper. Okay. Well, we're finished, and we'll do another one in a week or so
Okay.
over those last few chapters. And I'll post this one, and you can sign off and do what you please for the next little while, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Thanks for
Have a good
tuning in.
night.
I'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.